Welcome everybody, my name is Mikey Mhenna. We're going to get started. It's very nice to see all of you here. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Dana Sajdi from Boston College. Dana teaches various courses on Islamic history, but specializes in the history of societies, and cultures of the pre-modern Eastern Mediterranean. Her earlier work have focused primarily on the production of texts by unusual authors, such as 18th century Barber ibn Budayr. We'll be talking about that as we explore her book, The Barber of Damascus, Nouveau Literacy in the 18th Century Ottoman Levant. And she received a BA in theater and sociology from American University of Cairo, and her master's and PhD in Middle Eastern and Asian languages and cultures at Columbia University. She is a recipient of fellowships from the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture, the Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations, and I can't say that word in German, from Berlin. Help me out, Dana, what is it?
Wissenschaftskolleg.
There you go. We did it together. Teamwork makes the dream work. Dana, welcome to Afikra Conversations.
Thank you, Mikey. Thank you very much for inviting me. I've always wanted to reach out to audiences in the Arab world, and it's so great to be able to do this.
It is our pleasure to have you here. So you are in Boston right now, but you did not grow up in Boston. Before the call, I asked you incorrectly whether you grew up in Cairo, because I was trying to figure out where you grew up and I couldn't figure it out. And the fact that you went to American University of Cairo was a tip, but you didn't grow up there. Where did you grow up?
I was born and bred in Nablus, the Palestinian occupied territories. And then my family and I moved to Jordan in the late 70s. And then I went to Cairo for my undergraduate degree. But I also have a Damascene connection because, as you know, before the colonial hand divided up the Levant, Bilad al-Sham, many, there were intermarriages, especially between Nablus and Damascus. So all my great aunts are from Damascus. And so I have a huge extended family there.
Yeah, it was all the same place. So first of all, I appreciate you taking the time today. This is an extremely tough time for all of us, and I'm sure it's an even tougher time for you. So thanks for mustering up the courage and energy to talk today. Let's jump into how did you end up in Cairo, and how did you go from getting a BA in theater and sociology to deciding that you wanted to become a historian?
Great questions. So I'm from my high school, my mother had gone to AUB, and that was the obvious place to go. But my dad had gone to college in Alexandria, Egypt. And so the civil war it was not, the civil war had ended, but Beirut didn't seem to be a most safe option for me. So my parents prevailed upon me to go to Egypt, and my dad's love for Egypt is equal to his love actually of Jerusalem, where he was born. And so I'm like, why am I going to go to Cairo? It's hot, it's crowded. I'd never seen Cairo before. They're like, we'll go with you, and just, if you don't like it, come back. So it was just one day, and I could never leave Cairo. Every time I left, I was very sad. And so that's how I went to Cairo. As for my major, yes, theater and sociology. I thought it'd be a social worker by day and an actress by night. That's what I thought I would do. And I actually did cartwheels so as not to do history as a requirement, because my understanding of history at the time was it was names and dates, and I'm not prone to memory at all. And so it was a time when I was walking out of a sociology class into my theater training. It was the first Gulf War, and there was a bunch of students on campus who had the plaque. They were demonstrating, and they had the plaque, Salah ad-Din, the liberator of Jerusalem, Kurdish and Arab students unite. I'm like, what? Kurdish? What is that? And so it was this moment of realization of how Arab nationalism had appropriated heroes, right? And so it was that moment of questioning the religion that I grew up with, which is Arab nationalism, which I believe in still. But so it was a moment where I had to relearn history, and that's the beginning of my journey. So when I went to grad school, I didn't go to contribute, I went to learn.
Yeah, to fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
So the idea that you studied sociology, I wish I had known that fact about you before I started reading your reading your work, because it informs a lot of your work.
Exactly.
Because you're interested in society, and you are interested in the sort of vernacular. You're interested in the street more than anything else, maybe that's the best way.
Yes.
And the performance, of course. So let's talk a little bit about your book, The Barber of Damascus, which has a very sort of theatrical title. And then the subtitle is Nouveau Literacy in the 18th Century Ottoman Levant. I want to unpack almost every word in that title. Let's talk about the 18th century Ottoman Levant. What is interesting, I heard an interview you gave where you said everybody thinks that history in the Levant starts in the 19th century. Why is that true for those of us who are uninformed?
Well, there's actually, if you're thinking of the Levant in the long term, there are kind of two periods, which is the Umayyads, right? And then maybe the Mamluk period. And then somehow we don't learn much about the Ottoman period except the modern 19th century. And usually it is in the vein of the Turkification. And so it is about the idea of, kind of a foreign Turkish rule over 4,000, 4 centuries, and we kind of found our Renaissance and got rid of them basically. And so, also the 19th century is the Arab Renaissance, which is al-Nahda, which is a time when the public intellectual as a secular figure or even an Islamist reformer figure came to the fore, and it is when the use of print was it was a hallmark for the period. And so if you ask any Arab today, do they know a single, let's say, historian or poet from the Ottoman period? I don't think anybody knows, an average person, right?
Yeah.
And so this kind of darkness of the period is not only as a result of our own kind of the way we've constructed our own history in the Arab world, but it's also a part of the Orientalist paradigm where everything glorious was in the past and the Ottoman period was a period of decline. So basically the 18th century did not figure at all. And actually, let's say after Suleiman the Magnificent, which is from the Turkish side, is very important, go 17th, 18th century, it didn't figure at all in any history book or any work that we know, right? And so when I came to the 18th century, I realized even as specialists, the Ottomanists or the Arabists are very few. And it's a very understudied period, and it's a very interesting period. So basically coming into the 18th century for me was, I don't want to exaggerate it, but it's like going into a dark room where there's not many frameworks to work with in order to shed light on something.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
How did you become interested in it? Because people don't tend to sort of wander into dark rooms, so to speak. What drew you into that dark room?
So I was interested in the voice of the commoner, because I had been trained in the medieval period, where everything we do, all the sources that we have, or almost all of them, are written by scholars, right? And so I wanted to know how average commoners lived, that kind of thing. And so I was trained as a medievalist, not as an early modernist. And after a year of reading all the chronicles, I realized I had a lot of anecdotal evidence, but I didn't have something to work with towards something that I could build an edifice with it. So I almost quit grad school, actually. And then I read Tarif Khalidi's book on Arabic historiography, and he got to the early modern period, and there was a footnote. And it says there's a Barber historian, a farmer historian from the 18th century. So I immediately called him up in Cambridge, and I said, can I come visit you? And so that's where I learned about these works, and that's how I changed periods, and I had to go and learn Turkish and, you know, kind of take forever in grad school. So that was my story, which is footnotes have really determined my life, whether it is this book or my previous work on Layla al-Akhyaliyyah. I always follow footnotes.
Yeah, you can't ignore the footnotes. So I want to talk, you mentioned it just now, you said, you know, there's this text by the Barber, by the blank, by the blank, by the blank. So let's zoom back to 18th century Levant, Damascus in particular. What is happening economically and sort of on a societal level that brings the nouveau literate group to start writing? And how are they writing? I mean, are they literally putting pen to paper? I mean, yeah, walk me through this.
Okay, so there was a phenomenon of nouveau richness at the time. So since Albert Hourani said many years, like 3 decades ago, he said there's something happening in the 18th century whereby the decentralization of Ottoman rule is allowing for the rise of local families who are like, you know, it's like the Rockefellers have walked into town, right?
The merchant class.
Yeah, and not only merchant, but also governors who also had access to tax in a way that was not forwarded to Istanbul. So there's local wealth that is being generated. And so recently, al-Akhyaliyyah of Stanford has written about the phenomenon empire-wide, right? So in the Levant, rule becomes centered in the hands of a family called the al-Adn family. And so they're the local governors, and they're like they behave like dynasts, right? So it's the rule is going from father to son, and the family rules the area for the good parts of the 18th century. With them, there's a whole bunch of other families who are either mercantile or, again, are a part of administrative rule. And so there's a lot of new wealth, there's a lot of new building, there's a change in the topography, right? Because even Damascus itself starts being oriented towards the sea. It had been an inland, a center of trade that it was inland, and now there's a lot of Mediterranean trade, and it's kind of facing the sea more than it used to. And the French are there, the Italians are there, and so there is Mediterranean trade, and there is an invigoration in the economy of Damascus and the province of Damascus, which is the Levant. So there's a lot of wealth, and with wealth there's a lot of new networks, and you know, so there's a forging of an entire, not only new class. And my argument is that we always think about the rise of the notables as the phenomenon, but the rise doesn't happen by itself. There has to be an entire kind of social shift that goes with them. And my argument is that all of these new authors had entered new networks and have seen a bit of power or a change in social position. And that's what allows them to speak and to be. And that's when they start trespassing on the traditional playground of the ulama, of the scholar, where they feel they have the confidence for themselves to write. And that's why it's called nouveau literacy. It's not that these people did not know how to read before, the commoners. I mean, we know we have evidence all the way back from the 12th century, according to Konrad Hirschler. But the point is that people did not have the confidence to trespass into this new, into the public space. And so what I'm arguing is that this change in society has allowed these people to change position and to actually feel that their experience is worth recording and talking about and publishing.
Okay, so I want to talk about the word recording, because it's not, and why it's really a trespass. Because prior to the written word, the stories that are in the Barber's book I heard you say that you suspect that they were for performance to begin with. There is parts of it that rhyme. It's part of a broader hakawati oral tradition, and so was the act of writing it down the big trespass, or were these stories being told anyway in coffee shops beforehand?
Yeah. So this is, it's great. The Barber's Chronicle is really a hybrid between two forms. Okay. One form is completely scholarly. And so the fact that he writes biographies, tarajim, which is a very specifically very ulama genre, it's about the perpetuation of this class, the perpetuation of themselves and of their profession as such, and of the entire class. So, think of the tarajim as CVs, right? And so it's how these people recorded their lives and put themselves in a network, a corporate group that was self-perpetuating. And that's where I think about the work of Bourdieu, whom I use in the background of this, which is a field of competition, right? And so the fact that this Barber has the audacity to use the same form and allow other people to enter into the form, because historically it's ulama who were recorded and princes and, the elite. And so he allows the hakawati to become an object of this, of the tarajim. Now, in the Mamluk period, we do, or at least even in the Ottoman period, we do have some scholars who are allowing other people to enter the biographical dictionaries. So the tarjama is the biography, which usually occurs in either biographical dictionaries or in chronicles. So, but the Barber's use of it is an absolute trespass.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to jump a little bit to, there's something interesting going on in particular with, speaking of footnotes, with this book. Explain the difference between the 19th century version of this book and the original 18th century version of this book, for those on the call.
Okay, so there is an edited, refined, Baudelarized version of this chronicle by the Barber.
What is that word? I've heard you say it a few times. Baudelarized?
Baudelarized, which is edited to be made more refined.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. So, and it goes after someone called Baudelaire, who used to do that with texts. Which
I was trying to figure out what that word is. Okay, good.
Yeah, and so Baudelarized, it's an edition that refines and elevates the text and the language and its general appearance, basically. And so the 19th century version is done by an alim called Muhammad Sa'id al-Qasimi, who actually is the eponymous founder of a very famous 19th century family in Damascus of ulama. And that is the version that everybody knew, and that's the version that al-Khalidi wrote about in his footnote. And so what happened is that was the version that we knew and historians of the 18th century knew and cited. And so I was lucky enough to find the original version by the Barber of the 18th century, which is a unique copy, which is in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin.
How did you find this? I mean, how does one find this?
You just look through manuscript catalogs of manuscript collections, and I found it, believe it or not, at Jordan University one summer.
What song did you sing when you found that manuscript?
I actually just left the library shaking, and I smoked 5 cigarettes, I think.
Yeah, I mean, were you planning on writing this book before you found it?
Yes, because that was a part of my dissertation, right? And I had used the edited version for my dissertation. And so what happened is that one summer, bored out of my brain, I go to the Jordan University Library, and I go to the catalogs of manuscripts that they have, because Jordan University, معهد الوثائق والمخطوطات, had copies of the Chester Beatty Library, some of them, of their manuscripts. So I went through the catalogs, right? And under miscellaneous, there was this kind of title of a Barber, right? I'm like, what? So I asked them for the copy, so I get a facsimile, not a facsimile, what is it called? A microfilm. And lo and behold, it was it. And finally, I got to sew it as I was finishing writing my book. I actually traveled to Dublin to see the original.
Wow. What a find.
So how
What a
different
find.
they are? They're very different.
Yeah, so there are specific reasons why that I've heard you describe why they are different. It's not by accident they're different. The fact that he wanted to elevate the text isn't an accident. It's related to what happened with Arabic as a language, and what was happening locally, sort of on a societal basis. Can you walk through that a little bit?
Yes, so by the time that Saeed al-Qasimi was writing the Nahda, the Arab Renaissance period had already been in full force, right? So he was reading, Saeed al-Qasimi himself was reading printed journals. He was very interested in like Enlightenment ideas and scientific discoveries. And so he was this kind of figure that represents the new print age, right? At the same time, so at this time period, you have this reconstruction of history and books of the period before the 19th century as heritage, and thinking about history in the kind of more modern sense, rather than a chronicle, it is some kind of rise and decline idea. And so for Saeed al-Qasimi, I think what the Barber's text indicated to him was this great Azm family that had ruled in the 18th century. So his point was to actually not celebrate the Barber, but celebrate the family. So he did everything to suppress the Barber, but keep the content about the family and about Damascus in the 18th century. So for him, it was a matter of, I don't want to say nation state because he's not talking about nation state, but it's kind of local reconstruction of history and then looking at the past as heritage. So it's kind of a frozen thing that you work with as opposed to a continuity.
Yeah. What is the reception of your work in Syria and in the Levant in general? I mean, how do local scholars respond to this stuff?
It's so interesting because the book was translated into Arabic only in 2018, and it was very well received. And what I love about the reaction to it, so I don't want to say that it was received by scholars as such, it was received by the general public. So when I get reviews of it in all kinds of venues, so it's not scholarly journals, it's like you could be at actually my cousin was at the salon and she opened a women's magazine and somebody had reviewed it. So what I love about the way that it's being reviewed in the Arab world is that everybody's taking from it whatever they want. And it's not necessarily what I'm trying to say myself, but it just shows how much there's need for different perspectives to work with. And so I was delighted. Thus far, I still don't have an official, like a historical response. It's just people writing about it. And so it was reviewed in Lebanon very nicely. It was reviewed in Jordan in this journal called Hibr very nicely.
Hibr, I know, my friend Nina runs Hibr.
Yeah, and so I mean, so it's just, I love the way that they appropriated it, which is a book about appropriation, and it's been appropriated, which I love.
So in the following years, did people find their great grandfather's manuscript under the bed somewhere? Have like new manuscripts emerged since then? Because in your book, you talk about more than one. I mean, you talk about the Shia farmer, his son, the Greek Orthodox priest, 2 soldiers, a Samaritan scribe, a judicial court clerk. Like, it's not that this is the only one. Have more emerged and more scholars emerged with an interest to look into this stuff?
Not that I know of, except I still haven't checked. I know that there's a new, okay, so Firas Kremsky of Berlin has found a bunch of merchants, I think, from Aleppo, has found manuscripts of a bunch of merchants from Aleppo. And apparently someone else has just published a work on a weaver, a diary of a weaver.
So, I mean, this is a huge stretch, but I'm curious because, before the call, we were talking about podcasting and new media. And this, I mean, the work that they were doing was new media at the time, right? They were trying to enter this world and democratize their own voice and say, okay, cool, I want to self-publish. It was self-publishing, right? Essentially.
Of course, yes.
Yeah. It was, and so they were going onto the iTunes Connect website, creating their own podcast, going to Blogspot, creating their own blog, tweeting. They were doing that of the time.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I conjecture.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't have evidence, right?
We don't have evidence, but it was new media, and as a baseline. What happened to that afterwards? Like, what can we learn from what happened after this moment in time?
So
where are we going?
Okay, so I actually propose that the taking up of printing has suppressed all these people. So what I propose is that while we think of the print age as this new medium that has come from the West, from the encounter with the West, while it may be literally true in the sense that Napoleon brought the printing press to Egypt or whatever, I think that print could not have been successful and could have not, I mean, if you look at the statistics, it's like 12 new journals every day in the 19th, something crazy like that. And so I think that chronicles were the backbone and what informed print culture and print journalism. So if you think about the chronicle in the pre-modern period as the only way of recording daily events, right? And except for private letters and word of mouth, really, I see the newspaper article, the journal, as a continuation of that kind of query and that kind of public space or public text. So to me, print is a natural progression from the chronicle tradition. And the fact that we have so many people, I mean, what we have is what survived. So I can't tell you that everybody else was doing the same thing. But the fact that these 6 people that I talk about were not related to each other and were all writing in the same genre, it means that it was a popular genre. At least it occurred to people to write their chronicles as diaries, as public diaries. Yeah. And so for me, the appearance of print allowed only a particular kind of educated person in the modern education to become the spokesperson, right? And not these daily commoners who were kind of a fabric of everyday life.
Yeah, this is why the New York Times has blogs and podcasts now. Okay, let's move on to a subject that you also wrote about, which was completely new to me, maybe embarrassingly so, but was a poet that you wrote about, who is described that, possibly one of the most famous female poets in Arabic poetry history. Her name is Layla
al-Akhyaliyyah.
Akhyaliyyah. Who was born in what would be now Iraq and died in what was now Iraq. Am I correct about that?
Syria.
Okay, so she died in what is now Iraq in the 7th century and died in the 8th century. Who is this person? Why is her work so special? Why were you inspired to write about it?
Again, that was found in a footnote. I had not known, I mean, I had heard of Layla al-Akhyaliyyah from my mother, but I had not, because I never studied her poetry in school or in college, right? And so I found about her in a footnote, and it was by Statkovich, I think, where she said that she was explaining the phenomenon of the professional poet in the pre-Islamic and early Islamic periods. And the professional poet is usually a male. And so Layla al-Akhyaliyyah seems to have been the only, I mean, women had poetic voices, but they were not professional poets, i.e. they did not earn their living by their poetry. So Layla al-Akhyaliyyah seems to have been the first is it female or professional first, adjectively? The first professional female poet who actually competed in the market of poetry with men. So that was very exciting for me. And because the qasida as a form, the tripartite qasida, usually represents the male experience, I was wondering, as a woman, what she would do with the form. So again, it's about appropriation of a form in the way that the Barbers was an appropriation of a form.
What is the life of a professional poet like in the end of the 7th century? What does that profession mean? She was under somebody's employ, and she was supposed to be writing.
If you go and you give panegyrics and you get money for it, right? So it's about, it's about being patronized, kind of getting patronage in the way that artists, even in painting, you have to find a patron, right? So Layla al-Akhyaliyyah had found patrons.
And she was performing these herself, or written to be performed?
Probably, yes. I mean, we know very little about most of what we know about pre-modern and early Islamic poets are what medieval scholars have written about them, and usually their life stories are taken from their poetry and are imposed ex post facto. So there's very little we can know about her except through her words and through her poetry. But the fact that she had been compared to many other poets, she was a figure that lived.
Yeah, and aside from this chapter, if somebody's interested in learning about this poet, where should they be finding this information? Besides, so there's that footnote and there's this chapter. What else do we have?
I know that someone in Mali has been writing a PhD dissertation on her. That's all I know.
All right, blue.
It's all medieval works like al-Asma'i, and actually a great book to read about female poets is by my co-editor Marley Hammond. Of this book, she has written about women's voices from the the pre-Islamic period into modernity. So she's someone to consult.
Okay. So what are you working on now? I think there's another book in the works. There's podcasting. You're still teaching. What are you working on right now?
Currently, I am trying to write a book, and I say trying because it's proving very difficult, that is a history of Damascus based on a local tradition of descriptions of the city that started in the 12th century with the famous description by Ibn Asakir. And basically the tradition never died. Basically, I'm ending with Muhammad Kurd Ali's description of Damascus. So the point is to look at this tradition as an emergence of a genre reflecting a particular social formation. And again, the ulama are the big actors here. And it is a partial and a decidedly local rendition of Damascus through words. So I look at this tradition of what I call cityscapes as being very much like the landscapes of the Italian Renaissance, the paintings. It's a way of representing space that comes out of a particular social formation and a particular socioeconomic and political moment, and that is about the representation of space, and especially your city, over a long period of time. And it's a very much an intertextual tradition. So the point is to look at the word as a painting and a more expressive form of representation than the image.
I want to have a final question before we go to the quick Q&A about the history of Damascus. You mentioned this moment where it sort of pivots on its heel and it starts reshaping, looking westward towards the water. Is that part of this the sort of functioning narrative of Damascus? If you speak to somebody who grew up in Damascus and is, alive, do they remember that moment? Is it part of the collective memory of that moment?
No. And what is so interesting, what we call Old Damascus, the old city, is really an 18th century city. right? And so what is really interesting is what I grew up going to Damascus and the things that I looked at, most of the buildings and the areas were actually very much, so they're new, they're 18th century. Of course, the older stuff is still there, but the way that the city was reoriented in the 18th century is very interesting. And I don't think many people are aware of that.
Yeah. It's funny, like it's like St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg is a very new city, but you don't know that.
Yeah.
You go and you think it's super old. Okay, we're going to move on to the quick Q&A and then open it up to the audience.
Great.
So, what are you reading or watching right now?
What am I not watching? I watch absolutely everything.
That's a shorter list.
I mean, so what I'm watching right now, okay, I'm watching everything, but and I think Amina, who's in the audience, knows that because we've been talking on Facebook about this. So a couple of the things that I loved recently are a series one is called Babylon Berlin, which is set in Weimar, Berlin, and is a fantastic German production. And the other is called The Queen's Gambit. I'm sure a lot of you know it. And recently, I think I bonded with Amina on A Suitable Boy, which is a rendition of this fantastic book by, it's called The Suitable Boy. I forgot he's an Indian author. I forgot his name.
Okay.
Anyway, so I'm watching everything all the time.
Good job.
I watch all the time.
I support. Okay, who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
Okay, so two people. I want to be the secretary of Zahir Babers, Ibn Shaddad. Ibn Babers, Zahir Babers, the first Mamluk Sultan. And Amina, hi, she's one of the scholars of the biography of Babers. I want to shadow Ibn Shaddad, who was the Ibn Babers' secretary. He moved about, he witnessed the Mongol invasion of the region. He witnessed the end of the Crusades. He went from Cairo to Aleppo. I mean, the 13th century, it was so exciting and interesting. And so I think I would like to live in that century just to see what's happening, although it's very, very dangerous. But the other person I want to shadow is Ira Glass of This American Life.
Oh, that's a great one.
Yeah, and so I just want to learn.
Who doesn't live nearly as dangerous of a life?
I actually went to a show by him. I just want to learn how audio storytelling is done, and I want to adapt it for history.
Yeah, if I could spend a day, I don't want to spend a day with Ira Glass. I want to spend a day with the editor of This American Life.
You're right.
They're incredible. The editors are amazing. Okay. What do people most misunderstand about your work?
I think most people think that I do literature. So, I mean, yes, text is my primary object, but I do mostly history through the text.
Yeah. And you're mostly focused on, do you think there's something that separates you from most historians in your field?
I think so. I think I am very interested in the idea that an emergence of a genre is a social phenomenon. And it is about how groups of people represent themselves because they emerge as a group. And so for me, the genre is not just like a thing that happens. It's actually very much a result of a reality. So the text is real.
Is this something that, if I was speaking to you as a PhD student, is this something that you knew at the time? Is this something you had a hunch, or is this something you uncovered and realized, wow, I was wrong. I now have a different thought on it.
It's so funny when you apply for jobs or apply for fellowships. That's when you have to think about your life as a trajectory, and that's when it comes together. So honestly, I learned that I had an approach only when I was when I was in the job market the second time around. I wanted to put everything that I had written about in a particular kind of a logical trajectory. And I realized that I was always intrigued by the same thing, the appearance of a new voice, the appearance of a new genre. It's always that got me really involved. What is happening in the social structure that is allowing a woman to speak? What is happening that is allowing a barber to speak? So that's always been my concern, which is very sociological and social.
Yep. Okay, cool. And whose work do you admire or are inspired by? Again, I'm sure there's a very long list, but if there are a few that may surprise us or that you think we should check out.
Okay, so there's too many to answer, but I think the work that I've been really thinking, that made me think a lot recently, is something that I wrote in the chat the last time I was on afikra with Isabel Hamad, and it is by Amitav Ghosh. It's called The Great Derangement. And it's a book about the environment, and it's usually not something that I am very in tune with, but he makes this argument where, we cannot not look at the environment anymore. It's just not possible for us to ignore it. But why is it that we're not capable of understanding? I mean, there's these activists, but then there's the rest of us. And the way that he looks at the politics of the environment is so exciting, because he tells you the novel, the emergence of the novel as a 19th century form, has failed to take into account the environment and nature. And, he's a novelist. He had been a novelist. And so he looks at the form and the politics, our current politics, as some kind of evolution of a Protestantism without God, that it's all about bearing witness, and it is an absence of politics, basically. And so he links the genre to our most pressing concern right now, to ideas of responsibility in politics, and he also involves India and the environmental stuff that is happening in India. It is one of the way that he talks about literature, politics, and history together is just something completely inspiring. Wow,
okay. That's a good recommendation. Okay, Osman, you're up next.
Hi, Dana. Thank you very much for the talk. I'm really looking forward to engaging more with your work, especially the Barber of Damascus. I have a question. So my question is, a lot of our understanding of the 18th century, as you've already pointed out, emerges from the 19th century, and it's reflective of a 19th century view. And some of your work has obviously been peeling back the 19th century view to try and reveal the 18th century view. So one of my questions related to this is, what is going to come out in the next few years about the 18th century in this region? What new things are waiting to be discovered? And sort of connected to that, what are the questions we should be asking if we're interested in studying the 18th century?
Big questions, big questions. So I think we historians tend to look for what is new, right? And this is how, we're supposed to talk about new phenomena, new things. And as someone who has managed to publish or to work in different periods, every time, including myself, by the way, every time when we say that there's something new, we're mostly wrong. It will have happened in the Mamluk period. So Ottomans will say, this is the first time that this happens. Of course, it has happened in the Mamluk period. And if we look in the Mamluk period, it has gone before. So basically, I think one of the things to do as a historian is to look for continuities. And I think once we start with that, which is, in my case, it was when looking at print as something that is not necessarily new. Of course, it's new. But if we look at it as it could not have just happened out of nowhere, when you look at things like that, you're able to find continuities. And I think that's our biggest task right now, is to look for continuities within, that are deployed in the guise of the new.
Very cool. Okay, Faisal, you're up next. Let me get you to unmute.
Hey, Dana, thank you for giving us this talk. I just had a quick question about when we were talking about poets, female poets of kind of a certain time frame. I know that Rabia al-Adawiyyah also is a kind of a renowned poet around that time. And I was wondering if there was any comparison to Layla al-Akhyaliyyah.
No, not at all. Very interesting. So what she's compared to is usually al-Khansa, who's the elegist of pre-Islamic, or Mukhadrama. She's, between the pre-Islamic and early Islamic period. So she's compared to al-Khansa. But when Abu Tammam compares her to Qus ibn Sa'ida, who was a priest, a Christian priest of the period, and who was known to be an orator. He was not a poet. So that gives me a code that the medievals were looking at her also as a different kind of person, because to be compared to a Christian, these are two marginal figures, right, that are being compared to each other for their capacity and success in a Muslim male patriarchal regime, right? And so, so the way that people compare her to other people gives us clues about her location in the social political landscape, right? So no, she's never been compared to that, but the person who's most compared to her is the Andalusian Umayyad princess Al-Wallada bint al-Mustakfi, who was the beloved of Ibn Zaydun and who also was a professional poet. And what is interesting about both these women, and hopefully that's my next book, is in most cases the beloved as a woman never speaks back to the loving, the male who loves and talks. So Abla never speaks, or all these Maya never speaks, right? But in this case, in both these cases, Layla al-Akhyaliyyah had a lover who who composed his poems about her, and she writes back to him. And similarly, Walada bint al-Mustakfi and Ibn Zaydun is one of the most famous Andalusian poets, also speaks back to him. So my next book is about these two exceptional women who actually speak back to the male poets, the lovers, who are also, what are they called? Professional poets.
Great. Before we get to Yara, just a quick question, because you mentioned Andalusia. Is there similar scholarship that has sort of emerged on similar dynamics happening elsewhere in the Arabic-speaking world, whether it's North Africa or Andalusia or Iraq?
In what sense, in terms of scholarship on commoners?
Yeah.
I'm not aware actually, but I think because the problematics for the Islamic period in Islamic space are very different. Spain are very different. Mm. What people are interested in and what the conundra are is the interfaith relations, right? And so what most people work about is this identity issues, and and now the most famous stuff is the Moriscos, who are the Muslims who had been forced to convert into Christianity and who were crypto-Muslims. And these are becoming very important they are the Barbers. They are the people whom we want to discover, right? And so they had their own, so they were marginalized, but now we're starting to find books by them. And so they're the most interesting kind of current scholarship.
Great. Conundra is a great band name, by the way.
I made it up. I don't know if you actually do that.
I think that's right. Okay, Yara, you're up next.
Hi, Dana.
Hi, Yara. Nice to see you in a different...
Again, yeah. So my questions, basically, you're going to answer it with your next book, which you kind of answered in a way, that how was it socially acceptable for her to write all these poetry about Toba, the man she loved, while she's married to two men, and even meet with him? How does that inform us about the social status of women and their ability to do such a thing, as you said, in a Muslim patriarchal society? I mean, you've already said a little bit of that, so...
Yeah, the thing is, we don't know much, right? And we don't know whether the voice is separate from real life, etc. So that's kind of a difficulty that we can't. But I can tell you from all these people who have done research on the Ottoman period, that women were wheelers and dealers, right? And what we think, basically what we're doing is that gender relations were Victorianized through through colonialism.
Mhm.
And so we kind of tend to think about current suppression of women as something Islamic. Yes, definitely there was rules of segregation, there were rules of modesty, etc. But if you look at their activities, I mean, no Western women would have been able to do even half of what they could do. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not that simple. It's not, yeah, it's patriarchy, definitely everywhere till today, everywhere, right? Neither here nor there is different. It's just different, guises of it, right? But I think what happened in the Middle East, at least I wish I could kind of start my scholarly life again, is a Victorianization of marriage relations, of all kinds of things. And so the strictness is a middle class strictness that is very English and Victorian. And as Joseph Massaad showed in his book, that a lot of the laws were English laws.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah. Mhm. Okay, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Yara. Okay, great. Nana, thank you so much for joining. This has been really, really fun.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very, very grateful.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll be able to host in-person events in Boston and
Yes.
very soon.
And don't follow me on Twitter. I don't know how to tweet to save my life.
I posted a feedback link into the chat. It's one simple question: was this good? So please let us know if you thought it was, and give us feedback if you think we need to do things differently. If you'd like to support and keep this work going and growing and keeping everything free and open to all, please consider becoming one of our contributors. You can go to afikra.com/support to find out more about that. We have another event on Thursday and more events next week. So tell your friends. This will be on our podcast and on our YouTube page next week. So thanks for joining, everyone. Hope you had fun. See you next time.
Bye.